Hello, you're listening to Tony Slattery's Rambling Club, and you're most welcome.
Hello, I'm Paul Carmichael.
And I'm Allan Lederer.
And as you are no doubt by now aware, earlier this week we lost our lovely friend, the president of our Rambling Club, Tony Slattery, quite unexpectedly.
Yes, a very sudden, very short illness that came as a total shock to us and to Tony's family.
Yeah.
So he has rambled off before us into the great unknown wilderness that separates this vale of tears from the next.
Yeah. Something that you'll have been aware of is, of course, the massive outpouring of just absolute love that we've seen for Tony across social media, with emails, direct messages, and all sorts of things. And what we thought we would do to remember him is we would gather together some of his friends who are scattered about the presidential gardens, and we will go for a ramble with them and remember Tony together. So, Allan, are you ready for a ramble?
I've never been less ready.
No. Nevertheless, let's spin the machine and off we go.
Tony's enchanted bingo machine. A curious contraption of cogs, levers and glowing buttons that hums with ominous energy. This machine generates 3 completely random numbers. These numbers are fed directly into the Dewey Decimal System, the arcane reference system by which books and their contents are categorized. In this way, the bingo machine conjures from thin air a topic of conversation so enthralling, so wildly unexpected, that it leaves the members of the Rambling Club both bewildered and vaguely excited. Thus, another evening is saved from the brink of boredom, thanks to Tony's marvellous, possibly haunted and entirely inexplicable bingo machine.
Sir Stephen Fry.
Tony told me a lovely story about a production you were in together at university, but he said the main thing he remembered was simply that the two of you were just trying to make each other corpse on stage. Is that a sort of a familiar feeling when it comes to Tony?
There is. I never had a romantic relationship with Tony, despite how beautiful he was. I didn't. It never occurred to me really, and I had a partner anyway. But the next best thing, or even perhaps a better thing than a romantic relationship, is a relationship forged with laughter, which is what I had with Hugh Laurie and what I had with Tony. Tony before Hugh, in fact, because I knew Tony better before I really met Hugh. And yeah, we were at Edinburgh for the Mummers, which was a Cambridge drama group and still is. And we were in a production of a Middleton and Decker play, not a very well-known one, a Jacobean play called The Roaring Girl. And we both had rather ordinary parts. I think we doubled, trebled, quadrupled our roles as gentlemen of various kinds, and we both at one point had to play sort of foppish gentleman. And every day, every different performance, Tony would find a taller feather to put in his hat. He had a feather, and I noticed one day, I said, "You've got a bigger feather." I whispered to him on stage. He said, "Oh, really?" And just sort of showed it off. And he made me laugh extraordinarily at that. And then we almost wet the floor with laughter, because it just got bigger and bigger until it was brushing the very high ceiling of the venue in Riddle's Court in Edinburgh. And it was typical of him. It was just silly and enchanting and fabulous. And of course, we got in terrible trouble because the laughter became obscenely loud. But that joy of making him laugh and he making me laugh was something that we never really lost. And it is a gift. And it's one that he had in abundance. And rather like the other sort of real comic geniuses I've known who just have this mixture. And that's the thing, because there's a real difference in comedy. I think I said in the little Instagram tribute that I made that he was a wit and a clown. And it was very important to get those two words out because they're very different. You can have people who have a clowning genius that just are funny and they can move funnily and they just are to look at. They can make you laugh and with their silliness, and that's a clown. It's a wonderful and valuable thing to be. And Tony was a marvelous clown, but he was also a wit. And that's something with the brain and with language and with imagination and so on. And Peter Cook, whom I knew well, had them both and was perhaps the granddaddy of all of us in that way. And also had a long battle with alcohol and so on. And people shook their heads as if they were school prefects and said, should have tried harder and what a disappointment and all these absurd things. But like Peter, Tony's was free. He didn't save it up for talk shows, and he could be as funny and charming and sweet to the person he was buying a newspaper off in the street as when he was on TV, and that it was a gift that he just gave, and it was charming. But and of course it's easy to say afterwards, and in the light of his subsequent life and in the difficulties he faced, that he gave too much, that maybe he should have held something back for himself. But that's easy to say, but it's we're none of us real psychiatrists or psychologists, and we leave that to those who understand better. And it would be impertinent to try and read his character. What one can read is its effect on oneself and on others.
This is that.
Richard Vranch.
When was it that you met Tony?
Well, I think it was 81, but it might have been 80. And that's because I think Tony had come up to university in 79, and I'd already been there a couple of years. And I think we got on immediately because we both were similarly confused by Cambridge University, because it did seem a long way from the lives that we knew. And I think we had that in common. We hadn't sort of been to Eton, and we weren't used to that kind of person. And I think we made each other laugh and decided very early on that, we might do something together. And we put a little show on at lunchtime, because we were at the same college. Cambridge is weirdly divided into kind of small colleges. So in a small living unit, you've got people doing all different subjects. And I was science and he was languages. So that's good for mixing people up. But we were at the same college, a lovely little college called Trinity Hall. And we met up there. And very soon we put on a lunchtime concert, which they used to call yogurt concerts, because they gave people yogurt as a bribe to come in. And we did an hour of material called Ben-Hur on Ice, which is very ambitious title. I think we lived up to it. So in fact, I think because it was called a yogurt concert, we tried to crowbar yogurt into the show, because basically we tried to crowbar anything into the show because it was very thin, but we performed it with such sort of panache, and we wore nice jackets, so I think it was quite charming to look at, even if it was a bit thin. But anyway, I remember once the yogurt got tipped into the piano and we sort of hurriedly left. That happened in Edinburgh, I think, because we used to do this at the Edinburgh Fringe too, of course, and we'd back then the Edinburgh Fringe didn't have the super venues. It was there was a fringe club where everybody went every night, and you could do a bit of your show in the fringe club, and more or less the whole Edinburgh Fringe would see you, and if they liked it, they'd come along. So I remember doing bits of that show in Edinburgh a few years later. But yeah, it seemed like anything was possible, because we'd get together and have an idea, giggle, write it down, vaguely remember it, and it seemed to work, and it seemed so effortless, and it seemed that's what we should be doing, because when we got together, we always seem to come up with funny stuff, make each other laugh, and then make other people laugh when we put it in front of them. So it just seemed so easy, and it never stopped seeming so easy, really. I don't think it ever changed over the years, though, we'd bump into each other when our paths crossed in various, well-known things like the Comedy Store Players and Whose Line Is It Anyway, and so on. But I don't think we ever lost that sense of let's see if this will work, and it generally did,
Mulville. Jimmy Mulville.
That was a long time ago. I mean, he was in the Footlights. He was a year or maybe 2 years, maybe the year after I left. Him, Stephen Fry, Emma Thompson, Hugh Laurie took their places at Cambridge University, and a couple of years later, I was actually working as a radio producer, and one of the things we did was we go up to see the Footlights Review in Cambridge, and to see these young performers on stage, I mean, it was extraordinary. I mean, and the BBC tried to do a deal with them, I think, but they went off somewhere else. And then, of course, it was a couple of years late. It was a few years later. We all used to kind of know each other in that kind of scene in the 80s. It wasn't until to the end of that decade that he'd been doing, I think he'd just done Whose Line for us, and was brilliant. I mean, he had a filthy sense of humour.
Yeah,
listeners will be aware. Yeah,
it was absolutely delicious, and then he'd say something absolutely ghastly and filthy, and then giggle after it. So you kind of forgave him. I mean, he was always funny and irrepressible, and slightly. I always imagine him being slightly kind of on that edge of being manic, which is I know he suffered with bipolar, and a lot of people in my business have that kind of neurodiversity, and they harness it. When they harness it, they go out on the high wire, and on Whose Line, of course, it's a high wire act from beginning to end. So people like Tony were gold dust, and they could play with Stephen, they could play with John Sessions, and he made a real name for himself on Whose Line, of course. And then we decided to match him with Mike McShane, and they did a sketch show for us. With Dan Patterson as the producer. So, I first met him when he was a student, and then he went off and did his things. And it was when we were working together on Whose Line, and we were producing Whose Line, that I got to know him better. And then bizarrely, I got a part. I was an actor in those days. I hadn't woken up. I was still an actor, and they were still employing me. And I got this part in a sitcom called That's Love on ITV. And in those days, of course, there were 4 channels. There was BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, and Channel 4. So, you could do a show on I think our sitcom went out on Thursday night, and 9 million people would watch it. And then in the third series, they decided to change the storyline, and they actually made the lawyer. Terry wrote the script, so the lawyer actually had an affair with Lisa Goddard. And he came back one day from a trip, and he said, "I proved you right. I proved you right. You are right. I'm having an affair." And he was honest with her. Of course, the whole thing erupted, and we went into couples counselling, which I have to say, at the end of the 80s, early 90s, was quite a kind of, it wasn't a new thing, but you didn't see it on television that much. You certainly didn't see it in a sitcom. And I was thrilled when they said, Tony Slattery's agreed to be the couples counsellor. And of course, the storyline went that in his role as our counsellor, he said, "Look, I think you need space from each other. You need to live apart." And then what happened was, when we lived apart, I discovered he was dating my wife, and I hit the roof. And there's an episode, you probably might recall it better than I do, but I vaguely remember there's an episode where he falls from a window onto some thorns, and I have to pluck the thorns out of a naked Tony Slattery backside.
Yeah, over the kitchen table.
Over the kitchen table. And we had a lot of fun doing that. staring at Tony Slattery's bare bum was, I think, a career highlight.
Helen Lederer. Helen Lederer.
You remember the first time you actually saw him?
Yes, do you know, I try and remember that. And we recently did a friendship podcast where his memory was different from mine. So that's interesting already. I think I met him for the first time in BBC Radio in a meeting with Jeff Posner, who's also sadly passed away, who is a very important person, head of comedy. And I just, in that moment when you first meet, and this was in the 80s, so I have known him, well, ever since, I think more or less. I just about started stand-up. I think maybe I've been going for 2 years, but like the whole of my career, he's been part of that. We've shared overlap journey, the journey. So that, but then when we really got together, so there was the spark, you'd feel something when you meet someone significant. And I just remember going, "Oh," like that. That's the sound that I felt. And then I was looked at by Sandy Toksvig in a gig at the Finsbury Park, whatever it's called, doing stand-up. And I was deemed sufficiently okay by her to be invited to do a sketch show, a show with Tony Slattery, Sandy, me, and Nick, a person called Nick, and Simmons, I think, and it was called Happy Hour, and it was quite bad, and that's how we absolutely bonded. That's how I remember doing a sketch in Cambridge, like pretending to be in the trenches for some bizarre reason, and everything had to begin with B. So the whole sketch, I mean, quite tedious really, for not least for ourselves. And I just remember, as I'm sure a lot of you will, the hysteria within Tony that matches mine, I'd like to think, so that you are so freed up from constraint, which is my joy, as is his, that you would just laugh like a drain at all the badness in the world.
Nick Hancock. Nick Hancock.
Nick, when did you first meet Tony then?
So Tony was, of course, the impossibly brilliant, incredibly sophisticated, unattainably skillful and funny person when I first arrived at university. But bear in mind, I was 18, and he, this paragon of sophistication would have been about 20. And of course, that's ridiculous when you're an adult to think like that. But when you were at college, you kind of do, because if somebody's you've done so little in your life. If somebody's done two things more than you, they are, beyond comparison. But actually, the strange thing is, having said all of that, he did deserve that sort of, now not exactly genuflection, but that sort of aura, because he just was. I mean, we just talked about sport. He was such a consummate performer even then, not just comedian but actor, and very at home, musically, and all of those things. So I, having said all of that, I didn't meet him while I was at college, because I just didn't do any of that stuff, because it just all seemed far too sophisticated for me. But by the time I did do Footlights, which is the thing that I'm kind of referring to, which was the university, kids mucking about, pretending that they're funny. by the time I did do that, he'd left it. But that actually made him even more of a sort of not an eminence grise, but a sort of legendary figure, because he by then he was already working in television. I mean, I think he virtually went straight into doing OTT or something like that. I can't remember. But then I did meet him, because the people who I was doing comedy with at the time at college had been in shows with him, and he's a nice fella, so he used to come back and watch various things. But to me, he was impossibly glamorous. But then the moment you speak to him, of course, he's not going to play that role, and would never have thought himself in that role at all, and was just absolutely charming and kind and generous in what he had to say about what you'd done, and really made such well, I don't hope it wouldn't have been an effort for him, made you feel part of his world, if you see what I mean. When you were desperately trying not to be part of his world because you thought that was the right thing to do, and he just blew all that out of the water. I don't think he had any sense of that sort of hierarchy, or better than, or funnier than, or richer than, or more successful than, and never ever have I seen any of that baggage with Tony.
Hey, Alex Lowe. Alex Lowe.
Peter's Friends was the biggest film ever when I was in first year of university.
Yes.
That must have been just remarkable to work on. A lot of an amazing sort of like collection of people, and in the middle of it, you've got Tony Slattery. What was your first impression of Tony?
Well, great. He was always lovely, sort of Tony doing all his lovely stuff. He was. Well, you know what? Honestly, I'm a bit chippy about the sort of posh people in Britain. And I always feel slightly like what I am, which is a lower middle class bloke from the London suburbs. I'm not the kind of Oxbridge thing. I didn't go to RADA. I didn't go to public school or anything. And in a funny sort of way, although, I mean, it's fair to say Kenneth Branagh wasn't like that either. But in those kind of slightly, the higher echelons of British film and all that, and being an actor and a lardy actor, I've met a lot of quite posh sort of people. And it was nice to meet someone like Tony, who wasn't posh. He's from near where I grew up, northwest London. And he was very normal and lovely, and made me feel at home. I used to be Kenneth Branagh's stand-in as well. So I was, Ken Branagh used to give me parts in things, and I'd also be his stand-in. So I was always around for loads of it at that time. And I'd be absolutely, so thrilled to be there, but very, very nervous, and always aware that I could be axed at any moment, I always thought. And so Tony, getting a long way around saying this, it was, great fun to be with, a good laugh. We had quite a few laughs hanging around on the set. And I remember going in a car to film at a sort of, a steam railway place near Peterborough. And we spent hours in the car together laughing about stuff. So, he was very natural and normal. And, I was very relaxed to be with him. I always remember another thing, which was, there was a lot of kind of merciless piss taking. And I remember, there was one occasion, when Peter's Friends came out, I remember for some reason, Tony couldn't come to the premiere. And it might have been was he doing a play in the West End or a musical or something? And I can't remember what that was. What was it? Salad Days? No.
Our producer seems to think it may have been Radio Times.
Radio Times. I think I went to see it. But anyway, Tony came along afterwards, and I was sort of, young and trying to kind of keep in with Tony. And I remember saying, great in the film. My bum got a laugh, by which I meant my nude scene, like semi-nude scene, having sex with Emma Thompson. He said, do we see your bum in it? And I said, well, no, not really. He said, oh, I hope this story gets funnier.
Well, it's true that there was a time when people used to say, oh, Tony's on everything. And there was a time that was probably true. I think that comes from two things. Firstly, when you're young and you're in your 20s, you don't know if it's going to last for a year or 2 years or 40 years. So you kind of take the jobs that are offered to you because you might not get offered them again. So that's one thing, that you can't see the future. The other thing is, every job he was offered, he did bloody well because he was very good at lots of things. It wasn't as if he was token casting. He was really good at presenting on television, both on children's programs on ITV, also his film review program, Saturday Night at the Movies. He was really good at it. He was a good actor. And he looked great in adverts, so that's why he was offered those jobs. His voice was lovely, so he was good on radio. That's why he was offered those jobs. He was offered the jobs because he could do it. And although he was doing lots of things, he was doing every one of those things as well, if not better, than anyone else that specialised in that field. And so I thought it was a bit unfair when people said, oh, he's doing everything. That's not his fault. He could do it and was being offered it, and everybody wanted to do it, and everybody loved having him to do it because he was great to work with. So the only reason he did lots of things is because he was damn good at all of them.
I was thinking about this before, but I think there's a kind of reluctant admiration from the other members of our establishment that, most people don't go there. And to need to control him, which I sort of understand, like with the grown-ups in the business, and that was difficult. Those people who need to control others was very difficult working with Tony, but a joy when you're alongside him, because you would get, at best, you'd get sort of genius, and at worst, you'd get, where's the door? What's our exit route? Let's leave now. Can someone help us go? That's so special and so specific and worth mentioning, really.
And it's simply not for us to say what shape someone's life should take. We are not schoolmasters who are, writing a report on people. It's so, it's so British, annoying that. Yes, we can all say, oh, I would have loved it if he'd been in more films, or, oh, I would have loved it if he'd done a sitcom or another sitcom, or I would have loved ... Yes, but that's true of all kinds of people. And the point is the impression he made and the connections he had with people growing up watching him. And it's, sad, but yet wonderful that he finally believed that. There was that terrible period when he honestly thought that everybody hated him because he was that awful U word that was thrown at him, ubiquitous, and that he was smug and pleased with himself, as if. And I know, because I come over as that, so I know that other people will often say, "Oh, that smug ass Stephen," and you just have to put up with it. But he really did believe that no one liked him, which is heartbreaking. And the good thing about the last few years, really, from the Guardian article and the documentary onwards, and the last wonderful lease on life that you three gave him so wonderfully, with Mark, of course. Is that he finally understood the huge affection in which he was held, the immense place he had in people's hearts, which you can't fake. You can't, there are people who are admired, and there are, who say, gosh, yeah, talented. But Tony had that extra something that people saw and felt, and that's worth everything.
I do remember there was a time around then that people were saying, Tony Slattery's on everything. And it wasn't that long after that Tony was on nothing, and we were all desperate to see him back. In some ways, that criticism of a performer for spreading themselves too thin should be a criticism of the people that commission television programs, because they've so little wit and so little imagination and so little confidence in the show that they think the show will only work if we attach it to the person who happens to be attached to everything else at the time. So it's absolutely not. That's not a Tony thing. That's a laziness thing from producers of or certainly commissioners of television.
Yeah. Well, I always think, I might be completely wrong here, but that idea Tony had, that kind of working class thing of, I don't know where the next penny is coming from if this ends. I have some sympathy for that. I don't imagine he comes from a family who had tons of money and lots to fall back on. And I always think, I wasn't brought up down pit, but I certainly, my parents had this kind of Protestant work ethic about, you go to work at 9 o'clock in the morning, you come home at 5. And I always think that even now, I just turned 57 yesterday, I'm still always looking over my shoulder thinking, look, at any moment, you're going to have to get a proper job, Alex. It's bloody ridiculous. The great thing is no one will employ me to do anything else now. Even if I wanted to, it's great because that is it now. You ain't going to get a job doing something else at 57. But I feel the same probably about Tony, that he went, oh, my God, this is great. I've got to make hay while the sun shines and all that. And he was always good and everything. He was brilliant and everything and so sharp and so bloody funny. So I think that's right. But I mean, also, he's probably playing himself down a bit. He was absolutely beautiful looking and he was brilliantly funny and so sort of competent. And, you only have to look at the outpouring of love for him now on social media to realize people really love that. And it was something really, just as we've established, really human and really someone you felt you could talk to and be sort of close to. He didn't have a sort of imperious public school sort of, there are a couple of presenters I could name like that. He was a kind of nice, welcoming, happy, chirpy chappy, wasn't he? I mean, that's lovely and brilliantly funny. So, yeah, I think partly the reason, I mean, you're right. He's right, Tony, that people want a bit of the glory. But also, let's not forget how bloody brilliant he was.
Well, we know that comedy, if you go to a place, you make the unsayable safe. That's how I see it. And with him, obviously the delicious terrain would be to rubbish the world that has disappointed us or basically is very pompous or where we don't fit. I mean, there was a time when Tony fitted everything. People called him ubiquitous, out of jealousy probably. And that's how it is in our business. He was asked to do everything and he did it. I do remember going to his fancy flat on the Thames. They all had nice Persian carpets. Don't know if they're real or not. But that was, money's nice, work is nice. And then, you've got your own self to care for. So he just went through, as I said before, people who loved and understood him, as I know you do, you just know that he'll come back. He's gone away for a bit and he'll come back. And for all of us, just to not have that special loving person in your life, I don't think it's hit us because it's quite a lonely road, this job. I know not sympathy for me, but it is lonely at times when you're going your own way. And so to have fellow spirits along the journey, when they go, it's huge. And also for the audience, I mean, as you must have seen, the tributes, I mean, and it isn't a surprise but there Tony was an individual, but at the beginning of those 80s, 90s movement, really, of comedy. And people want that intelligence and that anarchy and, not representing the establishment. And yes, he went to Cambridge and everything, but he appealed to everyone. I think that's what people are marking, as well as his kind of mesmeric character, and you can't really define that too easily, I'm finding.
Yeah, there were so many things. This Just a Gigolo was a wonderful program too. A lovely acting role for him, and of course movies as well. He did so many things. Just people are remembering from Whose Line, I think, because that was probably the first thing they would have seen him on. And I think you often remember people from the first time you see them, and that's just human nature. And then maybe you don't clock some of the other things they do. So when you remember them after a while, I think you always go back to the first thing. And Whose Line made such an impact when it first came out, because it was so anarchic, particularly Tony was. And then that was at a time in 89 when there were only 4 channels. And if you wanted to watch something, you had to set the VHS. And people talked about what they'd seen on Friday night when they got back to work on Monday. So I think the impact of a program like that is hard to recreate these days. But back then it made such a big splash. I think it's natural that people will remember all of us that were on it from that first impact, even though, as you say, he did lots of other things too.
He was as insecure as anybody in this industry, but if you met him, you spent time with him, you realise he was very warm and Irish. He had the Irish gene of that immediate warmth and slight madness, in a very nice way, and liked to have fun, in all its forms, and sometimes to excess, and that's who he was really. But he did burn brightly. He burned brightly for 10 years maybe, and then obviously I think there was a burnout, and he went into another place and went on another journey, and as you're reporting, he seems to have been coming through that and enjoying his life, which in the end, I mean, I'm no spring chicken, and one has to enjoy the day really, because we don't know how many days we've got left, so it is a case of carpe diem.
There's a wonderful thing that Allan and I have talked about, which is when you were working with him, just occasionally you'd see this little glint and something would happen and you think, I don't know where he's going to go. And it could be anywhere at that moment. And it always took you by surprise. But you trusted him, didn't you?
You sort of trusted him, actually. I know you came together, Allan, sort of in the last, 10 years, the latter time. And I do know, I've seen it from every side, the going his own way moment. And that's Tony. I mean, that's what you get. And I think, I was thinking about this before, but I think there's a kind of reluctant admiration from the other members of our establishment that, most people don't go there. And to need to control him, which I sort of understand, like with the grown-ups in the business. And that was difficult. Those people who need to control others was very difficult working with Tony. But a joy when you're alongside him, because you would get, at best, you'd get sort of genius, and at worst, you'd get, where's the door? What's our exit route? Let's leave now. Can someone help us go? That's so special and so specific and worth mentioning, really.
Oh, definitely. Obviously, that came into its own when he was doing impro later. The stuff we were doing back in the early days was scripted, or it was scrawled down on scraps of paper at least. And so when that little glint came into our eyes and we went off-piste, that was very excited. And I think that's kind of sowed a seed of the improv that we were both later to do. But even during the scripted stuff, it didn't always go to plan. And the bits when we were winging it, I think the audience could see in our faces that was happening. And I think that made it extra exciting. And you still hear people today, and I agree, watching Tony doing improv, and you can sort of see that little impish smile come into his eyes. And exactly right, you didn't know what was going to happen next, and that was very exciting to watch.
Jimmy, how that massive energy that Tony had, how easy was that to constrain? Because obviously, if you're doing a sitcom, you're fairly constrained in terms of movement and performance. Did you find that he was able to sort of harness all that?
Yeah, no, I mean, he was a very professional comic actor. I mean, he knew where the laughs were, but he was a giggler. So he would giggle in rehearsal, he would giggle away. And, he would say something, off script. And, but he was irrepressible, irrepressible energy. And, when you're young, you can do that, and he had that kind of fantastic protean energy I think he just wanted more. He wanted more of the business. He never stopped working. I did sometimes think, I wonder if you're doing too much. You are working. I mean, he was so bookable. Everybody wanted Tony on. In the early 90s, I think, the early to the mid 90s, everybody wanted Tony Slattery on their show. There was no question. He was, he did so many shows, and he guested on shows, and he was on talk shows, and he was on panel shows. He was on Have I Got News for You in the very early days. He came on and did a gig for us on Have I Got News for You. And what was great was there was an episode where in the missing, I don't know if you're familiar with the show, but there's a missing words thing where they put up a headline and they redact a word and they say, da-da-da-da, blank. So this headline was, Lawson, who was the then Chancellor of the Exchequer for Margaret Thatcher, Lawson made Thatcher blank. And Paul Merton said, quick as a flash, swallow. We couldn't continue with the programme for about 5 minutes, I think, because of the giggling and, led by. So that was exactly the kind of thing that would make Tony Slattery giggle.
Yeah, a lot of the people who are remembering him on Whose Hands It Anyway are saying that he had an air of almost danger about him when he was improvising, which is one of the things I've remembered so fondly about him. You genuinely felt that something might happen that might get the show pulled off air at any moment.
Absolutely right. He did have that, and I'm sure the producers thought it as well, and they were probably sweating in the gallery watching it. But there was that wonderful potential that he might say something outrageous.
That's something we've heard a lot this morning, that Tony, one of his great gifts was that great warmth and his ability to connect with people from all walks of life without any, Nick Hancock said, without any kind of sense of hierarchy to it.
Completely right. That's a very well point, but very well put point by Nick. There was never that, and this gets into strange territory because it concentrates on that very idea of hierarchy, but the embarrassment of hierarchy could be the title of a sociologist's essay that would appear on Laurie Taylor in the afternoon on Radio 4, wouldn't it? The embarrassment of hierarchy. In both senses, there's an embarrassment of it because there's too much of it and we're embarrassed by it. But the very fact that Hugh and I and Emma had been in the Footlights before Tony joined, and that he had a year to go to finish his degree, whereas we left when we did, meant we were in a strange way senior to him. Just by a year. But as you know, when you're that age, these things are real and quite big. And it meant, for good or ill, that when Hugh and Emma and I left university in 1981, we graduated. There was Edinburgh, which Tony was in, but he was going back to Cambridge the next year, which he did. We went off, did a tour of Australia, and then we had a TV series. He was in Cambridge. I won't say stuck in Cambridge. He was now president of the Footlights, and he was fantastic. And he joined us in the TV we did for the BBC because the show, The Sellotapes, that we were all in together in 81, was then shown on BBC Two on television. It's weird to think now a Cambridge University review sketch show being shown on national television. I mean, talk about elitist. I mean, wow, we can imagine how furious the students of Bristol and Durham and Warwick and Hull and Keele all were, thinking, wankers. I mean, wankers. What are they fucking doing? How dare they? Who do they think they are? And God knows, we all felt that to some extent. Hugh and I in particular had that sort of public school with guilt, which and no one wants to hear about it. It's pathetic. But Tony seemed immune from that, because he was from a different world. He did go to a very good school. Gunnersbury was an excellent school, actually, and but it was a state school, sort of grammar. Was it direct grant? I'm not quite sure what the structural meaning of the school was, but the point is, it wasn't Eton College, And his background, right to the Isle of Arran. I mean, you think of the Flaherty documentary, Men of Arran. But the background, the Irish background, was real. When I say dirt poor, I don't mean that as an insult. It literally was. Farming at the most basic level, fishing and so on. And then in London, obviously, it's just where he grew up. But he was always, I've spoken to people who were at school with him, and he was dazzling then. He was absolutely dazzling. He had this charisma and this quality and style to him. And he was an all-round figure. He wasn't just skipping around daffodil, chewing aesthete. He was county standard and could have been national standard judo. And I remember at college, he threw me. I said, "Go on, show me the thing judo people do." And he just, I don't know what happened. I just sort of felt a something, and then I was on the floor. And I said, "How did you do that?" He said, "We're not allowed to tell." But yeah, so he and of course he had musical talent, which he didn't exploit, to my frustration, because I have none. So when I see someone with he had a beautiful singing voice, and he could play the guitar and compose, and it maddened me that he didn't do more with it, because I always think, if you've got that sort of talent, or if I had it, I would just bore people to the end of the earth with it. But he So anyway, I don't know what I was saying, but yeah, he was an all-round talent. He was more than just the odd clip you might see on TV.
Yeah.
The intellectual side's interesting, isn't it, Al? Because Tony had recently tried his hand with teaching, and he was incredibly good at it. He taught some of my students, and they absolutely adored him. He was quite strict with them. I know that he wanted to do more of that as well. He was excellent at teaching. Yeah.
Oh, well, I didn't know that, but that doesn't surprise me, because there's that fierce passion for what he does, and also his own frustration with himself that he couldn't do more. And I can imagine him teaching your students in a kind of ferocious way, because he felt so strongly and thought so much. He had a lot of time to think while he wasn't, in latter years, fully engaged. There's some, not everyone stays up there in full employment in our job. A few do, very few do. But I imagine, he cared about it. So he would pass that on to young people, and he probably wouldn't take any prisoners. I'd like to have seen that. Yeah.
Yeah.
How lovely to know you did that. How lovely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it related to what you were saying about him just before, and why so many people took them to their hearts. Is I think it's the same reason the students liked him so much. Is that a world that is so full of just bland corporate bullshit. And Tony was the opposite of that. There was no question of him, managing what he said for PR purposes or anything like that.
No. And actually, Alan, you saying that just because my brain's all over the place, it just triggered a memory. Just recently, we did a gig together, a literary festival, I think a month ago or something, and so there we were in the green room, and it's always so beautiful to meet him. You just go, "Oh, there you are, Tony and Mark," and it's just that beautiful. Hello, and. But then I always know that I'm going to go in a powwow with him, and we're going to do secret stuff, and we're going to be conspiratorial. And I just look just that moment. And a very nice woman came up to ask if we wanted a sandwich or something, or do something, like that. He said something to her and got rid of her very quickly in a very outrageous and direct manner. And then he said, I didn't mean that. I just wanted to talk to you. And again, that was... very direct, very unusual. I was thinking, oh my God, what has she heard? Because I'm the opposite. I'm thinking, we can't offend anyone. I'm going around wringing my hands. not wanting to offend people who are trying to do their job. But yes, quite bold and quite out there, and not observant of niceties, which is very beautiful to be around.
I always thought if he had been of a different mindset, he could have made being on stage with him hell, because he had such charisma and such ability and such, as we've discussed, physicality and such wit. And so, you know, a more selfish performer would have made everything about them. But he wasn't like that. I mean, he couldn't help but be brilliant, because that's what he was. And I'm not saying that, you know, in a post-mortem way. He was brilliant. You know, there was no doubt about that. Again, come back to improvisation. A very generous performer, and you know, strangely enough, not all performers are.
Well, the thing about Tony is that when he turned up, he didn't just phone it in. Sometimes you get a comedian or a comic actor, and they've you know, got a bit of a reputation under their belt. They've got a bit of success and a bit of fame, and they can come onto Whose Line or Have I Got News for You, and just phone it in, and it's very irritating, because you think, come on, sing for your supper. There was never a problem with Tony. He was always wound up and ready to go, but we just needed to edit him, because he would say things that you literally, if you broadcast them, you would be completely shut down. And probably imprisoned.
Yeah.
And maybe even put into exile. Certainly, you would have any kind of career complete. I mean, we would have invented cancelling had some of the things gone out. Like, some of the things came out of his mouth, you thought, wow, you're going there, are you? Okay, fine. And but the audience, of course, would crack up. They would love it. Because, of course, he would say it, and he had such a lovely face. He said, a lovely, warm, open face. So he'd say these incredibly kind of filthy things as if butter wouldn't melt in his mouth.
Yeah.
He was Tony was a delightful person. That's all I can say, really.
You're right. He had that. Not only was he warm like that in real life, but he had that great gift of being able to project that down the camera.
Yeah.
People really felt they knew him.
Absolutely. I mean, maybe it was slightly of its time in that. God, I'd love it to come back, but that sort of cheeky double entendres, you know, corpsing as if he can't believe he's getting away with saying certain things. I'd like to see a bit more of that. You know, why don't we have that? But what happened to fun and being funny and being smiley and sunny? They're all bombarded with misery nowadays. Can't we have more Tony Slatterys and more jolliness and sort of more playfulness? I'd love more of that. You know?
I think more Tony Slattery is, you can never have enough Tony Slatterys. We're all finding out, I think. The last thing we should obviously ask you is, how are you going to remember Tony? I mean, he was so many different things, but how will you remember him?
Oh, well, I think looking back, he was very much, I would say, you know, when I did Peter's Friends, it was the biggest thrill of my life at the time. But to turn up and just spend time with Tony, who was a major celebrity, and just feel, you know, relaxed with him and, you know, able to have a chat and a laugh. That's what I'll really remember, you know. To answer your question, a long way around saying I will remember him as a happy, smiley, sunny, funny chap from my time with Peter's Friends at a time when I was kind of very nervous and keen to, you know, keep in with everyone. That was a kind of safe house to go to.
He was super talented. He could riff, he could improv, and he could act. He could deliver a script. You know, he could learn the lines, not bump into the furniture, and be very funny. I had a lot of fun doing That's Love with him. But he could also think on his feet. He was a quick-witted guy, you know. I think, you know, he's one of those people that you're not unhappy to have met and worked with. And I have a list I could share with you that is otherwise.
Tony was probably the first person I knew who was, I would put inverted commas around this, famous. Okay, who spoke to me as an equal, as somebody who was, as a contemporary, let's say, as somebody who was famous. And do you know what? He really, really fucked up my idea of what famous people were like, because he was charming and lovely and inclusive and humble and kind and interested in other people. And that's not to generalize about famous people, but I've got to say there are very few that you meet who have that lovely sense of intimate, quiet kindness. Really,
I still remember me and him from when we first met, because I think we reverted to that age whenever we met subsequently. And so I just remember, oh, goodness me, going to see Tony, that's going to be a right laugh. We're going to go off in some direction that we don't know what it is and make each other giggle. And it's going to be fun. And that is how it always felt when I was together with Tony. And so that's how I've always remembered him, and how I always will, I'm sure.
Behind it all, there was always the Tony, the Tony who had this spark and this just unique, silly charm and this dazzling quality. And he never lost that, even when he slowed down and lost a little of the articulacy and so on. And he always laughed at himself, first and foremost. If you think of him, he's going... There was no self-pity. There was anger at the abuse, real anger, and that's a correct, but he was angry, yes, but he was never self-pitying. He never... And self-pity is... It's not only an unattractive vice, it's a very useless one. It doesn't help. And so in the end, I admired him. I admired the fact that he carried on and that he was able to stop hiding and able to be honest and upfront and open about the way his life had gone. And in that sense, I think of him as that youthful, glorious, handsome young fellow. Was always in there and was always radiating out, giving to other people.
Just for bringing strength and absurdity to the world and making people take attention of that. And obviously his own head, where his head was at times, what is good is he was coming back into the world at the time of his passing, so that's good. But it's a mirror to people who have mental health issues, as we call them. So together it's such a strong combination. But for me, I just miss him. I'm going to get... Yeah, we'll just all miss him, won't we? Because it's so unique.
Yeah. And here we are back in the shed. Our rambles for now are done. Allan, you've worked with... How many years did you work with Tony?
Well, we've known him for 7 years now, so we worked together for probably 6 of those. Pandemic interceding, of course, but we still managed to do some online stuff together even then. Yeah. So, yeah, we saw quite a lot of each other.
So if you think back, favourite memory?
I think possibly one of my favourite memories is we did a Zoom version of Improv Provocateur, which was a Whose Line style improv show. And it was Tony's turn to be improvising. And in the middle of his scene, the wicker chair he was sat in collapsed, and he vanished off screen in a squawk and a flurry of Slattery. And the wonderful thing about that was when he came to watch it back, he was laughing louder than anybody else in the room. And it's, as I've said to people on social media who've kindly been asking after him, one of my favourite things about Tony was that he was not in any way precious. If there was something to laugh at about him, he would laugh right along.
Yep.
There was no ego of that sort to him at all.
No. I remember, what I loved was things could get quite intense and quite heated sometimes with him as well, and very serious. And I do remember, and I will always remember, quite a heated discussion outside our local curry house with Tony, which I was having with him. And this continued as we re-entered the restaurant. And we were so in the middle of this conversation that we missed our table, went straight through some double doors, and we ended up stood in the middle of the kitchen, surrounded by staff all around us. And Tony just looked into a pot and went, "Looks delicious," and walked out. Oh, he was lovely. He was our lovely friend and our lovely colleague. But that's not the end of the Rambling Club as of yet. Tony, we know, was really so very proud of this podcast, just as he was of the live shows that he was taking on. And we still have a fair few weeks of Mr. Slattery to come, so you will be able to join us every Friday at 5 to 5 here in the Presidential Shed for Tony Slattery's Rambling Club.
Yes, you've not heard the last of him just yet, I'm pleased to say.
Absolutely. So thank you for joining us. And until next Friday, it's a goodbye from myself, Paul Carmichael. It's a goodbye from Mr. Allan Lederer.
Goodbye and take care.
And for a very final word, Tony's friend and collaborator, Robin Ince, is waiting for us in the presidential garden.
The first time I met Tony, we ended up talking effusively and animatedly about our mutual love of Powell and Pressburger's A Matter of Life and Death. We had a lot of common ground in terms of a love for those quite often black and white films. So, of course, A Matter of Life and Death is 1/3 black and white and 2/3 Technicolor. Oh, one is starved of Technicolor up there. Probably a misquote of Marius Goring in that movie. And we also talked about that beautiful opening scene where David Niven, believing that he is about to die, a doomed bomber captain, is talking to June down on planet Earth. And I love you, June, because you're life and I'm leaving you. And then the last time that we spoke effusively, where we rambled to a purpose, was at the Berkhamsted Book Festival in November of 2024. And we were meant to have recorded the conversation, but unfortunately, they're just due to various mishaps, we didn't manage to. But I thought that doesn't matter. We're going to have so many more of these conversations. But sadly, I was wrong. But the most important thing about that evening in Berkhamsted was the amount of love there was for Tony in that room. People were overjoyed to be in his company, to be so happy that he had survived so much, to be so happy at sometimes the silliest and most wonderful, never quite scabrous, but cheekiness of the stories and the comments. And I actually received the other day a message from someone who I don't know who was in the audience and said what a very, very special night it had been for her. So in remembering Tony, a little poem that I wrote initially when Tim Brooke Taylor died, and I thought how happy I was that at least I had had a chance to tell Tim Brooke Taylor how much I loved his work. And now it's really a poem for not just the comedians, not just the performers, but all of those people that we must remember to tell them now that we love them or we love their work, and not just wait until they're dead. We must get rid of that English malaise of embarrassment. Let me celebrate you now, while you can still hear the cheer. Don't let me wait until you're gone to be fond. Don't let fear of embarrassment stifle my delight. How the worry of impending shame leads us to talk about love only when there can be no response. We fumble and blush when praised or when praising, waiting to be caught out, rejected. I loved their mind. I loved their voice. I loved them. Past tense. It's hard not to fear the present, hard to be present, hard not to bend under a cynic stare, but keep the volume of things unsaid, the regrets of silence as thin as they can be. Let them take up little space on the shelf in your head. Do not hide your love for so long that it turns to dust. And all of this, I said, in my head, as you walk by. But not anymore. Not anymore. I love the bones of you.
Goodbye and thank you for listening.